Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, for making it here, braving the rains, and thanks to ETH for organizing this and inviting me to share my thoughts with you. Without much further ado, I would like to share some of my perspectives in a currently extremely uncertain scenario that we are facing globally and which has its repercussions on India as well. If you look at this slide on the screen, although India's official GDP forecast, official as in given by the IMF, is about 8.2% for this financial year, RBI has 7.2%. And of course, these numbers will undergo a downward revision from the IMF especially, given that it is 8.2%, and RBI is much more realistic at 7.2%. The growth rate for the economy this financial year could be close to about 7%, give or take 20 basis points on this side or that side. Given the way things are panning out, that would still be an extremely creditable achievement in the uncertain environment that we find ourselves in. And if you look at the World Bank projections, they already are down to 7.5 for this year, and IMF was also talking about 6.9% in the next financial year, 23-24. But even if it pans out that the forecasts are lowered as the months roll by, if you look at where we stand compared to other nations, our inflation situation is around 7%, and GDP growth is at the upper end. So if you look at where we are in the middle of the pack with respect to inflation outcomes. In fact, I would even argue that our inflation rates is probably closer to the lower end compared to others, in comparison to others. And the growth situation is we are among the better ones. Again, you might say that the relative comparison is not so much of a consolation, given that we all live on absolute incomes and not on relative incomes. But this is a global shock that we are facing, whether it is the Ukraine war and the impact on commodity prices or the US central bank tightening, etc. These are all global shocks, and the effects would reverberate through every country. And therefore, the relative standing matters, because that is what would eventually ensure that we remain an attractive destination for investment, domestic or international. So far, we are ending the first quarter of the current financial year today, and notwithstanding the various schemes announced by the government post-budget, such as the fertilizer subsidy, the food subsidy, etc., it's important to note that the government hasn't said it would end up borrowing more from the market, because we presented the budget in February with a lot of conservatism in the assumptions on GDP growth, on revenue growth, and there was cushion inside the estimates to be able to absorb shocks such as what we have faced since then. And the important plank of economic growth from the government standpoint, having done whatever it could in the previous 2-3 years despite the pandemic, such as lowering the tax rates for corporate income, settling the decade-long retrospective taxation dispute, coming up with the emergency credit line guarantee scheme for medium and small enterprises, and announcing a strategic roadmap for privatization, and then following it through with the privatization of Air India, etc. Having done all of these things, in addition to that, on the fiscal front, the government's contribution to growth has been capital expenditure. In the financial year 21-22, the government spent 5.92 lakh crores against the budgeted 6 lakh crores or 6 trillion rupees. And in the current financial year, we hope to spend about 7.5 trillion rupees. And this includes 1 lakh crore interest-free loan of 50 years to the states also to undertake capital expenditure. And we believe that this is the most important and effective stimulus a government can give under the current circumstances. Because capital expenditure is what drives employment growth more than tax cuts or handouts to population, etc. And that is why the bulk of the fiscal resources has been dedicated to putting in place capital expenditure, which is also short-run employment generating, but also lifts the long-term potential GDP growth as well. Of course, many of you, having seen the 5th anniversary of the GST that is being talked about right now, and I myself have an article in Mint today. The important thing is, yes, inflation has played some role in the big growth in collections in April and also in May. But it is also important that as a share of GDP, in spite of the pandemic, GST collections have gone up from 5.8 to 6.4% last year in 21-22. That shows better compliance, and that also shows better acclimatization of the industry, both services and manufacturing, with the GST regime. While there is much talk of GST, obviously, restricting the taxation powers of the states, we must remember that previously, before GST happened, states had no right to tax services. But GST now gives them an opportunity to have a say in the taxation of services as well. So it is indeed a fiscal federalism at work. And if you look at the formalization of the economy, it is a much misunderstood term, because many people, without working through the logic of or the veracity of the statement, say that Indian labor force is 90% employed in the informal sector, 80% employed in the informal sector. But I would like to point out that the previous Chief Economic Advisor, Mr. Dr. Aravind Subramaniam, within 6 months of the GST having been rolled out, wrote a very important essay in the Economic Survey 2017-18, talking about how much of India's economy was formalized. And he put the estimate already 5 years ago at 30 to 40% and not 10 to 20%. So in that sense, in the last 5 years, with the advance of digital public goods, with the advance of GST, this percentage would only have gone up rather than come down. What is the important strength that the Indian economy has at this point, while we are definitely facing the shock of high oil price, high fertilizer price, high edible oil prices, and then a central bank of the Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, everybody tightening interest rates, creating dollar shortages, etc. In spite of all of that, we do have some strengths that will stand us in good stead, even if we are not exempt from the short-run consequences of what is going on in the world. One important strength that we face is because we went through a period of adjustment in the balance sheets of banks and non-financial corporate entities last decade. So since about 2015 or so, banking industry went through a period of asset quality review, writing off bad debts, increasing provisioning, mergers, and as well as capital infusion by the government. As a result, the bank's risk-weighted capital ratio is at a healthy level. And also, the corporate sector lowered its debt to GDP ratio, coming from 73% down to 53%, and the banks have made enough provisions such that the bad asset ratio has come down. Of course, banking system stress was compounded by the stress faced by the non-banking financial sector as well towards 2018, when IL&FS collapsed and some housing finance companies went through a period of distress as well. So, but all of that has been put behind us. But before we could reap the advantage of a cleaned up banking sector, of course, came the pandemic, followed in quick succession by the war in Ukraine. So my point is, this structural improvement is poised to help the economy grow at a sustainable, healthy rate in the remainder of the decade once the current uncertainties dissipate. And as you can see here, there is a pickup in the non-food credit growth of the banking sector. Of course, some of it might be due to high inflation, but even then an inflation rate of 7% is not too high by historical standards. If anything, it is in line with the historical average of India's inflation experience since 1970, about 7%. So there is a pickup very clearly from a low level of 8% or so, or even below 6% in 2021, which of course was due to the pandemic. There is a pickup in credit growth, which is a good augury. And that is what we see in the first quarter of this year, notwithstanding the war, notwithstanding the oil price hike, and notwithstanding input costs going up in general. The momentum in the Indian economy remains pretty good at this point in time. The Indian rupee has depreciated, and we have updated the last 2 days of depreciation as well. Indian rupee has fallen about 6.2% against the dollar since the beginning of the year, but in comparison to several currencies, including traditional safe haven currencies such as Swiss franc, etc., Indian rupee has done well. Now, clearly, when a central bank like the Federal Reserve raises interest rates and dollar becomes attractive, and there is a risk aversion, so that foreign capital flows back to the US, as has happened over the years, whenever the US raises interest rates, there is a capital outflow from emerging economies back to the US, because interest rate differentials shrink, risk appetite drops, and most investors tend to go back to safety of their home territory. That happens invariably, and this time it's no exception, especially since the interest rates are going up from 0%, and the Fed is talking about raising interest rates up to 4% or 5%, etc. And therefore, given all this, rupee depreciation is inevitable and may even be desirable in order to accommodate the current account deficit, in order to make imports slightly more expensive in this current difficult situation. But what is important is to manage the pace of rupee depreciation gradually and smoothly without disrupting businesses and their plans. And that is what the RBI is doing. So rupee depreciation is happening in a gradual manner and in a manner which does not raise concerns about the underlying financial and macro stability. Of course, one of the other strengths besides an improved and repaired financial system is India's digital transformation. You can see that in the number of UPI transactions, which has gone up by about 2,570 times in the last 5-6 years, and the value of transactions last financial year was more than $1 trillion. More than these statistics, what is important to us is many Indians now get a digital footprint, get a digital track record, and that over time will increase and improve their access to finance. And therefore, they will become part of the formal financial network as well. And the impact of all of this in the macro performance is hard to understate. It will easily contribute at least 0.5% to the GDP growth, potential GDP growth in the years ahead. And more importantly, India's digital transformation has happened in a manner wherein it is not at the mercy of private operators, but they are public digital goods, on top of which private service providers develop apps, etc. So it is not exclusive, but inclusive, and that is what is going to play a very big role in ensuring that what was initiated back in 2015 with the Prime Minister's Jan Dhan Yojana gets an additional leg up from digitization, whether it is the concept of account aggregators, factoring, cash flow-based lending, and the newly initiated open network, digital commerce, etc. All of this are built on the foundation of public digital goods platform, which is income agnostic, which is not in private hands, which happens to be developed under a missionary mode rather than a mercenary mode. And this impact will be extremely positive and important on GDP growth going forward in the rest of the decade. And these are the important features of India's digital transformation compared to other countries: low-cost accessibility, global adoption, that is also a soft power projection by India, and it is also ONDC, open network digital commerce. I would call it open network democratic commerce. And overall, India's priorities have been, in the last 3-4 years, despite the pandemic, despite the war, and there is no wavering on these things. Privatization is something that was not happening for almost 2 decades, since 2003, 2004, and that has come back, not only into the lexicon, but also into execution. And then we have a sustained capex push, which I showed you the slide earlier. And one of the things that digital transformation of India has facilitated is the targeted delivery of welfare payments, both in cash and in kind, by the government, based on the JAM Trinity, Jan Dhan Yojana, Aadhaar, and mobile phones, enables very little leakage of government benefits, and they directly reach the beneficiary. Government debt has gone up everywhere in the world, including in India in the last 2 years, because the denominator, GDP, came down and government expenditure went up for security reasons, for health reasons, etc. But the path towards consolidation is unmistakable, and we want to make sure that India's public debt is sustainable. And we have undertaken both structural and process reforms. The PM Gati Shakti dashboard, which facilitates information sharing across ministries, proper sequencing of projects such that the implementation cost and time overruns come down. That is also going to be a game changer with respect to public infrastructure projects. Process reforms, telecom sector, disinvestment, settling retrospective taxes, etc. We went through most of that. And then the faceless assessment, decriminalization of Companies Act. All these things are signals that what dominates the headlines of pink pages alone do not constitute economic reforms. These are the plumbing of governance, and there is a clear attention both to the plumbing of governance as well as the superstructure of governance under this regime. And then if you look at the new age economy that is coming up, we talked about quite a bit, digital transformation. And then the MSME sector, there is a new definition of what constitutes MSMEs. Both turnover and investment criteria are used. The emergency credit line guarantee scheme ensured that most of the MSMEs could navigate the last 2 years of economic shutdown and disruption without going through a major existential crisis. And now there are things like factoring and account aggregator, which is ensuring that MSMEs are able to address the biggest drawback that they face or a headwind they face, which is access to finance. And that is where I think the private sector can play its part. As long as we pay MSMEs on time and do not use MSMEs as a source of working capital for ourselves, large enterprises can play a very big part in ensuring that the Indian economic pie grows larger. Because one of the things we notice is that both public and private sector large enterprises, unfortunately and sadly, end up using MSME sector as a source of their working capital. But that is myopic thinking. What we need to do is to ensure that they are paid on time, if not well in advance of the due date. And that is what will keep the economic pie growing. And even if our share of the economic pie remains the same, if the pie becomes larger, the absolute take that we all enjoy naturally goes up. As far as the production-linked incentive scheme is concerned, this provides a snapshot. Many of the projects are still in the capital expenditure phase. Production has started in 1 or 2 areas like mobile phones, large-scale electronics manufacturing, white goods, and telecom and networking products, but most of them are still in the investment phase by the various companies that have applied to be part of this. So as the years move on, then the employment potential of the PLI schemes, the contribution to manufacturing, and the contribution to exports will pick up. These are still early days to be able to say whether they have delivered or not. They are still in the takeoff stage. I will be remiss if I only paint a very rosy picture, which is a medium-term prospect for India, no doubt. But in the short run, as I mentioned repeatedly in my earlier remarks as well, there is a big challenge we face. India's foreign direct investment on a net basis was close to about $40 billion last year, but portfolio outflows have happened last year and continue this year as well. The Fed is tightening interest rates, and we have no clarity on where the oil price would end up and what kind of evolution will it have. Just yesterday, we had Mr. Jay Powell, speaking in a central bank conference in Portugal, and he admitted, after 40 years of inflation targeting, he said that central bankers have very little clue about the inflation generation process. What causes inflation to pick up suddenly and what causes it to remain dormant, as in the case in Japan, etc. So there is very little understanding of what are the underlying forces that give rise to inflation. Therefore, there is inflation uncertainty, And in that uncertain phase, central banks in the developed world are going to raise interest rates, liquidity will dry up. That will be felt in both in unlisted and listed markets. Fundraising will become a challenge. Capital markets will be generally risk-averse, etc. So all these headwinds are there, and I don't wish to minimize them. What I want to point out is that the strengths that India enjoys, which is medium-term macroeconomic and financial stability, the platform for potential growth created by digital transformation, infrastructure creation, government's capex push, and then the commitment to both structural reforms and process reforms on the part of the government, these will ensure that once the current headwinds dissipate, then the medium-term strengths and potential can shine through in the remainder of this decade. And this kind of shows you the kind of interest rate projections that the Federal Reserve is looking at. They expect to raise the Fed funds rate to almost 4% by the middle of next year, as you can see in the last line of this slide. So overall, my message here is that India has come through the pandemic thanks to its excellent vaccination program and measures taken by states and the union government in containing the spread and the fallout. And now, with the Ukraine conflict having come close on the heels of the third Omicron wave in India, the third wave, the government is responding both with welfare measures targeted at the low-income and poorer segments, as well as continuing its thrust on capital expenditure so that the medium-term growth prospects are not affected. So I would submit that notwithstanding the challenges we face, the Indian economic growth story remains one of promise, potential, and performance. Thank you very much.